Alright, we're on. So hello everybody, we are once again coming in for this week's video, in which is playing off of last week's. So continuing the Russian Revolution here, we are on video number 3, because there's going to be one more after this that I don't think is going to be that long compared to the other ones, and it's really not even the revolution. It more goes into the Civil War, and that's what the last one will be, is the Russian Civil War. But for today's, this is probably the second most important video out of this little continuation, because today is the second revolution that Russia experiences during its revolutionary period, the Bolshevik Revolution, also known as the October or November one, depending on which calendar you're going off of. The Soviets typically called it the October Revolution because they went by the old calendar, so we'll call it the October or Bolshevik Revolution for the purposes of this. So this is the October / Bolshevik Revolution that occurs in 1917, where the Bolshevik Party, the communists, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky and others, they finally seize power by overthrowing the Provisional Government that has been in place since the abdication of the Tsar back in February/March of that same year. So, as we went through last week, we more covered just the summer of 1917 and how it kind of showed that the provisional government really didn't have a firm grip on power. It was almost powerless in many ways. Of course, they weren't doing much to really help the public's perception of them, given the factor that they weren't really responding to some of the needs of the cries of the people. They were continuing the Russian involvement in World War I, even though the Russian people and even the army were pretty much at the point that they wanted to get out of it. They obviously, I think it was shown by the summer of 1917, the provisional government was out of touch, and the Bolsheviks, as extreme as they might have been on the political spectrum, and I'm not trying to defend them here, but I will say that at the time, I think the Bolsheviks' call for immediate peace might have been better and more appealing to the Russian people, just because they had endured a lot of slaughter. I'm not endorsing them by any means, because what they did afterwards was downright some of the worst things that probably a human could ever do. And we'll get into that eventually. But for the purpose of what they were at least preaching, they were preaching something that was more admissible to the Russian people than the provisional government was, which may ultimately have been a factor as to why this second revolution was able to be successful. So the last thing I believe that we had commented on in the last video was we had the July days that had occurred, where the Bolsheviks had staged an initial revolt that had failed in July of 1917. Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders ended up going into exile while others were arrested, only to be released a couple of weeks later when the military under General Kornilov tried to stage a revolt in a military coup against the provisional government, which was ultimately repulsed, but also continued to show that the provisional government was quite weak. So that brings us up to roughly late August, September of 1917. So we're going to go through just a few more things here of what leads up to the eventual revolution, and then we'll hit the revolution. How exactly that happens is actually relatively quick, surprisingly. Compared to the February Revolution, the October Revolution was very quick. And then we'll just go over a few things of what the Soviet government that gets established immediately does almost as soon as they gain power. In this video, I will not discuss the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. We will discuss that in the next video, because that kind of falls in line a little bit with the start of the Russian Civil War, but we will get to that. For those of you that might already know about that, how Russia actually gets out of World War I by basically signing this horrible treaty with the Germans that literally gave away half of Russia to the Germans. That honestly, even though I get they were trying to get out of the war, but why would you sell your country out like that? But we will get to that. So to start here, well, again, we had the Kornilov Revolt. That was the last thing that we covered in our last video, where it gives a fresh opportunity for the leftist-leaning Bolsheviks to kind of mount a revolt of their own, because they had been defeated during their first revolt during the July days, partly because there wasn't enough popular support for the Bolsheviks in order to, go against the provisional government. There just wasn't enough popular support there to really support their revolt in July. They now are going to take into account the presence of counter-revolutionaries, people like Kerensky, who are actually going to move against any revolting attempts to start another revolutionary measure. They're going to take that into account in their planning for the next round. And they recognize that we need to renew the revolutionary fervor of the people. The people were not with us in July of 1917. That is why we could not seize power. So we need to get them in the same mood they were in about February, March, when the Tsar had to abdicate when the February Revolution took place. That's the kind of attitude we need right now. And they come to the conclusion we need to fire the people up again if we're going to try this again and have success. So the Bolsheviks begin this process by reviving the hatred of the military officers. They knew that the whole discussion of military officers who usually came from the bourgeoisie classes, the rich upper classes, elitist people, the nobles. They knew that the common people and common soldier had a dislike of the officers. And if you remember, the Petrograd Soviet had issued its infamous Order Number 1 that had basically decreed that soldiers no longer had to give these elitist salutes to their officers, that they could actually defy the orders of their officers. That came about. So the Bolsheviks know there's a hatred for the military officers, and they start exploiting that again. They start riling up that hatred that is already there. And of course, it had gotten worse since, the February Revolution, because in June 1917, of course, you had the whole failed June offensive, the Kerensky offensive that had failed spectacularly, was a military disaster. The Russian army had disintegrated. That certainly didn't help the officers', image in the eyes of the common soldier and the common people. And they also had a wave of massacres that's going to start enveloping around Russia because people are starting to get riled up. Bolshevik agitators in the army, you have Bolshevik agitators in the public that are, feeding them this propaganda message that, oh, these people are to blame for so many, injustices upon the Russian people and the Russian army. They're to blame for our losses to the Germans and everyone else. It riles the Russian people up to the point that you start having massacres. They go on full-on massacres trying to just kill and murder these officers that they are now blaming for the deaths of their fellow Russians or their family members or friends. In response, the All-Russian Executive Committee that was part of the Provisional Government, the All-Russian Executive Committee of Soviets, they sent emissaries to stop these massacres. Now, the problem was, although this was a good move trying to get these massacres to stop, the bad move was that the emissaries that they sent were usually Bolsheviks. They were Bolshevik representatives primarily because the moderate representatives, they were losing their hold on the masses at this point by around late August, September of 1917. So the executive committee really didn't have much of a choice but to send the one group of representatives that hadn't quite lost touch with the people and the people might actually still listen to, even though kind of a dumb move considering that these are also the same people that riled the people up to the point of a massacre in the first place. But yeah, let's send them to be the emissaries to calm the whole thing down when what they started. So the Bolshevik supporters end up growing rapidly since July. By September, the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets are now entirely dominated by a Bolshevik majority. They have other parties in them, but if you recall during the earlier months, while the Bolsheviks had been in both the Moscow and the Petrograd Soviet, they were a minority party. They did not have any major political sway at that time. By September, that has changed. They are now in the majority in both Soviets. So two of the most prominent and most important Soviets in provisional Russia, in the Provisional Government of Russia, are now Bolshevik dominated. That is not good news for the Provisional Government when this party is actively seeking your overthrow. So by September, they are now in the majority. Moderate leaders have now been replaced with prominent Bolsheviks in leadership positions in the Soviets because, of course, the majority party is probably going to make sure that its leaders are from its own majority. And Petrograd, the leader of the Petrograd Soviet, becomes Leon Trotsky. Trotsky gets control of the Petrograd Soviet, perhaps the most important of them all. And in Moscow, you had another prominent Bolshevik, Viktor Nogin, who becomes the main he becomes the leader of the Moscow Soviet, we'll put it like that. I know they had a specific title, but I can't seem to find it. So Lenin ends up writing, shortly after this, Vladimir Lenin, who of course, is still back on the stage. He writes to the All-Russian Executive Committee, and he urges them to break from Kerensky and declare themselves as the new Russian government, because now he sees it as, well, this Soviet committee, we hold majority in most of the Soviets now, so if we just have them declare themselves to be the new government, it'd be a relatively quick and painless revolution. That doesn't happen. Because although Lenin is still demanding it, despite his pleas, the committee refuses to do this, and they continue to follow Kerensky unofficially. They don't make a public statement saying that they're going to follow Kerensky, but they continue to maintain the status quo. However, they do a very interesting change in that although they were still officially supporting Kerensky, the committee decided they were going to withdraw all of their representatives from the government, which kind of weakens the provisional government a little bit further. So, okay, you're going to support the provisional government against the Bolsheviks, but yet at the same time, you're making it weaker by withdrawing your representatives. There's a little bit of, dialectation there over, okay, what are your aims? Now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, in response to the executive committee refusing to declare that it would go against Kerensky, they ended up declaring the executive committee to be traitors to the revolution. Now, at this point, the Bolsheviks have a little bit more power sway to do such a thing, and this definitely impacts the public's perception of the executive committee. And shortly after calling for that, they begin working openly, like out in the public open. They're making public announcements. They're making it more than known to even the provisional government leaders that we are seeking to overthrow you and get rid of you. We will get rid of you. They're going out and making announcement speeches in the public eye, saying very prominently, we will get rid of you, we will dismiss you, we will arrest you, we will do whatever we can, but we will take power from you. It's kind of bold, knowing that you're not the one in power and that saying such things could get you jailed. But you know that you have the people behind you at that point, so that you're not even intimidated to say things out loud. And I think it was more of an intimidation to the provisional government, because the provisional government, yes, they could try arresting these Bolsheviks, but what are you going to do? You arrest them and have a 40,000, mob come at them? It was kind of intimidation on the Bolsheviks' part. They knew they had the provisional government in a spot that they couldn't just easily respond. 6 months since the start of the revolution, and the government was already becoming extremely weak by this point. By September, the Soviets now hold the real power, despite the provisional government supposedly being invested with full sovereign power. It is really the Soviets who hold the main power in the cities and the factories. The Soviets and all the cities and the towns are frequently would actually defy the provisional government. They wouldn't listen to Kerensky and his ministers. They just basically did their own thing. So even though the provisional government is the head of Russia, it really isn't exercising any kind of authority over these Soviets who were blatantly just defying it on every turn. Now, many of the Soviets had Bolshevik majorities at this point, and the provincial ones even start acting as semi-independent republics. They start kind of acting as almost like a mini nation, because they won't obey the provisional government, and they're basically looking out for themselves at this point, ignoring the provisional government completely with a Bolshevik majority. You also have greater movements by the different nationalities, the Finns, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, Estonians, the Polish, all these nationalities that were not Russian, that had made up part of the Russian Empire. As soon as the February Revolution had broken out, they started to kind of vivy a little bit for their own independence. But at this point, they're full on taking advantage of the provisional government's ineptitude and just outright declaring independence, and then making the Russian army weaker, because now soldiers from those nationalities are now defecting and deserting and going home to help defend these newly proclaimed nations of their own nationalities. So they're leaving the Russian army. The Ukrainians are leaving the Russian army. The Belarusians are leaving the Russian army. The Estonians, the Latvians, Lithuanians, the Polish, the Finns, Finland ends up gaining its independence directly from the Russian Revolution and directly from Russia, because in the case of Poland, it was kind of from 3 different countries, With the Baltic states, it was almost the same story, but with Finland, and of course, Ukraine and Belarus got reconquered. But with the case of Finland, they actually gained independence during the Russian Revolution and defended it, and still have it today. So there's all kinds of things going on that are just making the provisional government look like they're inept. You're losing your country as you're speaking. It's literally breaking apart, either because different nationalities are declaring their own independent nations, or different provinces are acting like their own mini countries because they don't want to obey you. People in the towns and villages are also not helping because they're causing general anarchy and chaos because there are bread shortages. And what do people do when there's bread shortages? In history, that usually teaches us they'll go mad and frickin' riot. They will go out and, they destroy things. They're angry at whoever's supposed to be giving them bread. In this case, it was the government. So the people in the towns and villages are going on bread riots. And they want bread. They want in these riots, they basically make two demands. We want an end to the war, we want bread, and we want one more thing. We want land. We want to be able to own the land that we have farmed, but yet, even though we're not serfs anymore since 1867, we still have to pay these nobles and landlords. We still have to work for them. So they argue we want peace, bread, and land, which becomes kind of a major battle cry for the Bolsheviks over what they're offering to the Russian people should they take power. This brings us to roughly the end of September. And this is going to be a major turning point into lead up to the October Revolution. Now, with the chaos and anarchy at home, the war on the Eastern Front continued. Germany, of course, was taking full advantage of the factor that Russia's in chaos. They had blatantly beaten back the June offensive, and now were continuing their march into Russia on the Eastern Front because they're basically facing it unopposed. They can take what they want, and there's very little organized Russian resistance to their advances. By late September, the Germans were penetrating much deeper into the Baltic provinces in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They're moving up toward Petrograd, which is kind of right there near the Russian border with Estonia. On September 29th / October 12th, if you're going by our calendar, the Germans ended up capturing the island of Saaremaa, which had secured their command of the entire Baltic Sea. And this puts the capital of Petrograd directly at threat. The Germans are actually getting within range that they can actually possibly mount a major offensive on Petrograd to take the Russian capital. Now, the ministers of Kerensky's government, they make perhaps one of the biggest mistakes they could possibly have made at this point in trying to maintain the loyalty of the people. And that when they get news that the Germans are in control of the Baltic and that they've secured Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, instead of, staying there at the capital, putting up a fight for it, their initial decision that they were going to do, well, we'll just transfer the capital to Moscow. We'll abandon the city. Let's just abandon the city, get out of here. We'll go to Moscow and set up a government there. That may have been, in the logic sense, that may have seemed like a logical choice militarily, because obviously we don't think the Provisional Government probably could have withstood a German attack on Petrograd. The Provisional Government definitely could not have. But to give up your capital without a fight and simply just move it, how do you think that's going to make the public feel? That is not going to make them that confident in you. This is only going to strengthen the Bolshevik scheme for overthrowing the government, as they are now accusing Kerensky and his ministers of treason because they are wishing to continue the war and they want to abandon the fortress that is the capital. I mean, St. Petersburg was literally originally, and it still does, it still has a massive military fort within it that back in the day was its main military defense. The city itself is a fortress. Even to this day, if we actually went to war with Russia, St. Petersburg / Leningrad / Petrograd, whatever you want to call it, it would be a very difficult city to capture. It's one of the major cities in Russia, and it itself is almost its own military hub. And that was the same back then. So the people are angry, and the Bolsheviks are now accusing, okay, so you want to give up our capital, do you? Well, now you're traitors, and you're making it more than plain. You want to continue a war, but when the war starts not going your way, and now we're at threat of losing our capital, you want to give it up without a shot fired. This is only going to strengthen the Bolsheviks' adequates for arguing that the provisional government needs to be gotten rid of, and it easily rouses workers to oppose evacuation within the capital. They refuse the evacuation orders. The evacuation orders are actually given by the provisional government, but nobody's following them. The ministers, realizing this, they realize it's a major mistake and it's not going well. They very quickly reverse course. They say, "Okay, never mind that. We're not going to abandon the capital. We're not doing that." But the damage has been done at this point. Even though you reverse course, the fact that you issued an evacuation order, that you told the people you were going to do this, that was enough. That was enough in the people's eyes to condemn you as traitors and usurpers. You are not representing the Russian people. Even though you just reverse course, but they realize the only reason you reverse course is because none of us were listening to you. So, realizing that many in the capital now actually agree with the Bolsheviks, the provisional government is trying to replace the troops of the Petrograd garrison with more reliable troops. One, because they realize the Bolsheviks are starting to gain basically the allegiance of almost everyone in Petrograd by late September, early October. So the provisional government decides we need to get some loyal troops in here. So let's replace the main military force in the city, the Petrograd garrison, with loyal troops from the front. The Bolsheviks, in turn, begin to prepare for a military organization against the government in response. Trotsky ordered the Petrograd Soviet, to constitute a revolutionary committee that would declare itself the highest military authority in the capital. And this would be publicly, it was for defense against Germany, because we're thinking of, an offensive is going to be coming toward the capital. But secretly, it's basically creating a general staff for military revolt by the Bolsheviks, for a Bolshevik revolution that is led by a military revolt. And Trotsky is a master at hiding this. He's able to manipulate the masses into believing, oh, this is simply for your defense, not that, well, this is also a stage, a military stage for a revolt against the government here in just a few weeks. And what kills me is Trotsky was able to do this without interference because of that. He had absolutely no interference from the provisional government or any other body in Petrograd that had any authority, because they honestly believed his lie that it was simply for defense. Now, the outbreak of an actual Bolshevik revolt is going to depend on when the convocation of the second All Russian Congress of Soviets is going to take place. That is what is going to determine when are we actually going to hold this revolt. Now, the first Congress had been back in June of 1916 is when the first revolt came about. Well, not revolt, but the Congress. In June of 1917, the first Soviet Congress had been held, and it had elected a central executive committee which was given power to convene a second Congress at a date no later than September. So they elect a committee and say, okay, we're going to invest the power of this Congress into you. You are in charge of setting the date for the next Congress. Now, this was not simply a Bolshevik Congress. It had other political factions, including those loyal to Kerensky that were socialists, and you also had Mensheviks, who were more moderates than the Bolsheviks. They were leftists, but not absolute Bolsheviks either. They were more moderate. Now, the committee was a majority Menshevik and socialist, which is kind of odd, because that's also in a bad situation, because now, keep in mind, most of the Soviets are now Bolshevik majorities. The Bolsheviks dominate the Soviets, but the committee that's in charge of convening all these Soviets into a second Congress is dominated by their opponents, by the socialists and Mensheviks. So, although the committee has this authority and the power to set this date for a second Congress, they don't jump on the opportunity to call for a date, and they actually postpone for as long as they possibly can, because, again, why would you want to convene a bunch of people that you know are out to get rid of you and set a date for them? So, for as long as they can, they kind of stall the calling of a date. Eventually, the committee finally set a date of October 25th, 1917, or if you go by our calendar, it's November 7th, after the Petrograd Soviet had then threatened to convene the Congress itself if the committee did not act to call a date. The impending Bolshevik majority would absolutely most likely declare against the Provisional Government. That's why they had delayed so long, but at this point, they were faced with either you do it or the Soviets got to do it itself. Many had but the mistake that's being made here at this point with the convening of the Second Congress of Soviets is that many believe that the final showdown between Kerensky's provisional government and the Bolsheviks would take place within the political confines of the Congress. They didn't believe it would be an armed revolt. They believed it would simply be a political takeover of the Soviet. That the Soviets are now dominated by Bolsheviks, the Congress will convene, and that'll be the end of the provisional government. It will be merely a political takeover. They didn't expect it would be somewhat militarily as well. Now, the belief of this showdown within the Congress that's coming, this political showdown, made it very easy for Trotsky to pretend that these, preparations that he's been making, these, the organizations of these troops, the organization of workers, it's very easy for him to pretend that they're merely for defense and they're only being preparations for the creation of a Soviet government through constitutional process, that it's not going to be any kind of, armed takeover. We're doing this purely within the bounds of political constitutional structure. And that makes it very easy for him to convince the masses that, yeah, this is what's going to happen on October 25th. Nothing, we're not going to have a violent takeover. We're not going to do anything of that sort. We're just going to use what the process, the provisional constitution has right now for us to take power, and we'll use it. Now, what was bad here was anybody with seeing eyes could realize this was not the truth, that Trotsky and Lenin and the Bolsheviks were lying, that they were up to something. And Kerensky is as naive as a fiddle, because he literally believed them. He did nothing to oppose them. He was naive as possibly all get out, because as several of the regional congresses had even called for the termination of the coalition and a new Soviet government, yet Kerensky did nothing. He didn't believe there was any seriousness to the situation. Of course, the Soviet government is gaining this. The Soviet government idea is also gaining support from the masses because they're promising land to the peasants. They're promising placing factories under worker control, and they want an immediate cessation of hostilities. They want peace. They also want to deal with food shortages by expropriating the supplies from capitalists and landlords, from the rich people. So they're saying everything that people want to hear. So the people are like, hot dog, I'll take a Soviet government. It's going to give me what I want. Ugh. So on October 21st, just 4 days before this planned convening of the Second Congress of Soviets, Trotsky ended up confronting the General Staff with an order that all orders of the Congress should be countersigned by the Military Revolutionary Committee. Upon the committee's refusal, Upon the General Staff's refusal to accept this order, Trotsky ordered that the Petrograd garrison to take up arms in defense of the Soviet. That the General Staff is plotting against us. They won't take an order from me, even though I'm leader of the Soviet. They're plotting to, move against us militarily. So we're going to put this order in place anyway. We're going to override the generals, and we are going to order that the garrison arm itself now for defense in case these people try anything. The garrison ended up passing a resolution on the very next day, on October 22nd, that they would refuse to obey the orders of the General Staff, and they recognized the Military Revolutionary Committee, of which Trotsky was also a very big leader of. They would be the ones that would give the orders. They would not listen to the General Staff. Kerensky, realizing now only fully realizing about 3 days before October 25th what might happen, that the Soviets are making basically a power grab, the Kerensky then gives an ultimatum that the resolution be repealed, but it was entirely ignored, and Kerensky, being very naive, did nothing. I don't know if it was him so much being naive in that situation, though, as it could have been he just realized there was nothing he could really do. He could demand, but could he actually enforce it? In response, the Soviet actually organized worker detachments, which become the first Red Guards, which we have probably all have heard of them. Red Guards of the Soviet Union and Soviet Russia. And these are worker detachments from the factories that are arming themselves with guns and weapons and everything else for the defense of the Soviet and the committee in the Military Revolutionary Committee HQ at Smolny Palace. So not only do you have the Petrograd garrison, who's going to arm themselves for the defense of the Soviet and the Revolutionary Committee, but now you have the Red Guards, which are common factory workers that are arming themselves, common civilians that are taking up arms against the provisional government and arming themselves for the defense of the Soviet. Kerensky ended up, in response, he raises all the bridges on the Neva River to sever communication between the left and right banks, hoping that might try to cut off some of the coordination going on between the Soviet and the Military Revolutionary Committee. But his other mistake is that he requests that he be given dictatorial powers by the Council of the Republic, by the other ministers, in order to deal with the incoming Bolshevik revolt. So he asked the other ministers, I need to be basically a dictator right now. I need those kind of powers in order to quash this revolt in the name of the revolution, in order to continue Russia's progress. And it just goes a step too far. His ministers, although they support Kerensky, they're not for giving him the powers of a czar. They're not for giving him a dictatorial power, and they refuse his request to give him such powers. Instead, they set up a committee of public defense, which is not going to hold that many people because most people are with the Soviets at this point. Without violence, just a day or two before the planned convention of the Congress, the Bolsheviks even managed to seize control of the telegraph and telephone office in Petrograd, and they also managed to seize every government office except for the Winter Palace, which was the seat of the Provisional Government, the former Imperial Palace, and the General Staff offices. They did not seize those, but any other general government offices in Petrograd by 2 or 3 days before, the Bolsheviks were in control of, and they were also in control of the telegraphs and the telephones coming out of the capital. Lenin congratulated the delegates as inaugurating a completely new era, basically, of control. So this is going to lead to that fateful day, October 25th, 1917, the day of revolution. On that morning, Kerensky was actually not in Petrograd. He had actually left Petrograd that morning, and he had gone to the front to try to get some military troops to come back to Petrograd to crush this incoming Bolshevik revolt that he knows is about to happen. Meanwhile, the other government ministers, they remain in the Winter Palace. They await Kerensky's return. They don't want to make it look like the Provisional Government is absolutely fleeing the capital, so they'll let Kerensky go talk with the army commanders, see if he can get some troops back, while they'll stay there in the capital and try to man things there. The palace, unfortunately for the Provisional Government members, soon came under siege as a massive crowd of 40,000 people ended up gathering outside, and on the backside of the palace is the river Neva. And on the river Neva comes a literal battle cruiser ship, the Aurora, which is manned by Kronstadt sailors who are in line with the Bolsheviks, and this battle cruiser comes up, sails on the river behind the palace, and while they got a armed 40,000 strong mob in the front of the palace, behind them they now have an armed merchant battle cruiser that has got its guns trained on the backside of the palace in the riverfront. And on the other side of the river, the Peter and Paul Fortress, that ancient fortress in Petrograd, well, not ancient, but the old military fortress in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks ended up seizing that fortress as well, and they had turned the artillery and guns and everything against the Winter Palace and aimed them there as well. So at this point, the Winter Palace is under siege. The Provisional Government is under siege. The General Staff buildings have been seized by the Bolsheviks at this point, so the last stronghold of the Provisional Government on the day of October 25th, before the Congress of Soviets has even convened, is the Winter Palace. Just a 40,000 strong mob of protesters, of common people, of Red Guards that are ready to come in and arrest the Provisional Government leaders. You have the battle cruiser on the back of the palace that's ready to open fire. You have the fortress across the river that's got its guns trained on you. They're trapped. The government, the Winter Palace, the Provisional Government, meantime, get this. Yes, they have some supporters, surprisingly, but you tell me if this would make any difference. You have 40,000 people outside that are waiting to get inside the palace. The Winter Palace only has 137 female soldiers from a woman's battalion of death defending them and a couple of Cossack cavalry. Not anything near 40,000. The government was then given a Bolshevik ultimatum that they were to surrender, and all other government buildings were to be captured as well that they still held. So basically, the Bolsheviks issue an ultimatum: come out with your hands up. We have you. Surrender now, because you're not getting out of this. We have the power here. When the ultimatum was refused, the Aurora ended up firing on the palace at around 7 p.m. with a single shot after the Provisional Government initially refused to go with the ultimatum, and at 7 p.m. the Aurora ended up blasting a single shot. They didn't bombard the palace, but they did unload one complete shot at it just to scare the crap out of the Provisional Government. The palace was then stormed from the front by the 40,000 people, and they came in, and the government members ended up being found in one of the writing rooms, I believe it was, and they ended up being all arrested. The only Provisional Government member that ended up escaping it was Kerensky, since he wasn't in town at the time. He had escaped, and he had actually managed to gather some support from General Krasnov to attack the revolt that was going on in Petrograd. And on October 29th, Krasnov's army captured Zarko Selo, which was about 28 miles outside of the capital. However, he ended up being beaten at the Battle of Pulkovo and retreated that same day. And with the Battle of Pulkovo and the retreat of Krasnov, it also ended Kerensky's provisional government. Kerensky fled into exile from Russia. He was the only provisional Russian government leader not to be arrested, and he ended up later, I think, getting to the United States, and he died over here in the 1970, I believe. But at this point, the provisional government is gone, and the Soviet government is now immune, pretty much, from any kind of immediate power grab within the capital. They've won an almost bloodless revolution, an almost bloodless takeover. When the Second Congress eventually convened later that night, the non-Bolshevik members protested against the Bolsheviks' illegal, unconstitutional seizure of power that they had used the military and everything else to do so, and they protested this. In response, Trotsky kicked them all out. He kicked out the Mensheviks, he kicked out the socialists, he kicked out anybody that wasn't Bolshevik within the Congress at the convening later that night. So yeah, that just shows that they were not willing to compromise with anybody at that point, and they kind of were dictators in the waiting, because at this point, all right, you have a differing opinion? Guess what? Get out of here. So at this point, the Bolsheviks have seized power in the capital. At the same time that they had seized power in Petrograd, they also seized power in many of Russia's key major cities, including in Moscow. Moscow, Ekaterinburg, I believe, was also one. I'm trying to think of any others that I know of off the top of my head. I believe they had one. Where was it? Tsaritsyn initially, I think, had one, but I'm not certain on that one. But Moscow was the major other one that they had also happened. In Moscow, there was pretty much the same story as in Petrograd, very little resistance. In other areas, there was some violence and resistance across the Russian countryside, but in almost every major key Russian city, it was over with by the end of October 25th. The provisional government was ousted, and the Soviet government was now in. Russia was starting to turn communist. Now, the new Bolshevik regime that is being set up is going to they're going to use the Soviets that exist in the different cities. They're going to become the backbone of the new Bolshevik state. And by late November, the Bolsheviks are now holding power throughout Russia enough to the point that they can start creating a state. So that brings us to the start of the Soviet government. I think here, do I have one of those? Ah, I do. Where is it? So this is a picture of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg today, or was Petrograd. It was the Tsar's old imperial palace, but during the Provisional Government days in 1917, it was the seat of the Provisional Government. And this is from the River Neva. This is the River Neva here. And on the day of October 25th, you had Red Guard units in the crowd, armed civilians. This is a picture of a Red Guard unit from one of the factories of about 40,000 people in front of the Winter Palace trying to get in, and they eventually did, and they stormed it. And then on the other side of the river, you had the battle cruiser Aurora, which had been manned by Bolshevik-leaning sailors of the Kronstadt. And the Aurora, this is a modern picture. The Aurora is actually still exists. You can go, I wouldn't recommend going there right now, but if this war in Russia ever changes a little bit with how they are to foreign citizens, maybe, but the Aurora actually still exists today. It is a museum ship in St. Petersburg that you can actually still go see. Ironically, still anchored on the very river that it was when it was behind the Imperial Palace. So that brings us to the new Soviet government that is now created as of October 25th. Now, the Congress of Soviets declared that the power of the government that night would be held by the Council of People's Commissars, and this would be appointed mainly from the Bolshevik Central Committee. Lenin became premier of the new Soviet state, of the new Soviet Russian state, or whatever you want to call it. We'll call it Soviet Russia. But it's not quite the Soviet Union yet. But Lenin is going to become premier, and Trotsky is going to become Commissar of Foreign Affairs. He's going to deal with foreign relations. Now, the first act came on October 26, which would declare that all land that belonged to those who worked it without rent or payment. This would satisfy the demand of the peasants, who all they wanted was land. So day one on the job, the Bolsheviks like, okay, here's your land. So if you work it, guess what? You get it. On October 29th, a universal 8-hour workday was put in place and instituted, and the factory Soviets were given control over their respective industries. The peace campaign began on October 27th when Trotsky, in his new role as foreign minister, he wirelessly telegraphed all the belligerent nations and was trying to call for an immediate armistice amongst them all. Of course, the Allied nations, who are supposedly Russia's buddies, they aren't going for it. They immediately protest Trotsky's telegram, and it's partly A, they're already suspicious of communists, but B, they also suspect that Lenin is a German agent and working for the Germans, so they're not in any way going to agree to an armistice. So they outright deny the Bolsheviks' plea for an armistice. The Allies instead tried to have a Russian army commander, the Russian army commander-in-chief, actually, the General Dukhonin, they tried to get him to oppose the Council Commissars. Unfortunately, Lenin had him replaced, and then later that month, that general ended up being murdered by a mob. So thus ended the Allied hopes of trying to outright, go against the Bolshevik regime in internal affairs. Germany, however, and the Central Powers were ecstatic about the offer of an armistice from the Bolsheviks, and Germany agreed to the proposal, and a 10-day truce was signed on November 22nd. However, the Central Powers would still maintain troops on the Eastern Front until a formal peace could be secured, which we'll discuss in the next video. Now, despite the armistice, the Soviet government did face some difficulties. For instance, since most of the leaders of the Soviet government were made from the Bolshevik Central Committee, you were rather limited on your talents that were there. There were actually none of the Bolsheviks really had any kind of personnel trained in finance, transport, or industry management, so they were not the best set up to handle an economy. And the bourgeoisie class, who kind of stayed silent during the October Revolution and been shocked that it even succeeded, they're now starting to mount a passive resistance by refusing to cooperate with the provisional government. Well, not with the provisional government, but the Soviet government. And these are the same bourgeoisie who are in charge of the country's economy, because there's private enterprise. They're in charge of the banks. They're in charge of almost everything that has to do with finances, individual industries, banks, factories, whatever you want to call it. And that's going to be a problem, because they're not going to work with you. How are you going to prevent the Russian economy from collapsing? So Lenin's answer to this is he nationalizes the banks when they start to refuse to cooperate with the Provisional Government. He puts them under the direct control of the state, saying that, okay, we're the state now, you're not wanting to cooperate, so for the safety and protection of the people and the Russian economy, we're taking control now. So, bye! And when the bourgeoisie class tried to sabotage the factories also ended up being nationalized, and a new Supreme Economic Council was set up to manage them and keep them out of the hands of the bourgeoisie. Other nationalization decrees would soon follow that would begin the concept of war communism that we're going to see throughout the Russian Civil War. Now, nationalization, contrary to popular belief, was not the main goal of the Soviets at first, or the Bolsheviks at first. It was not on their original plans. Popular belief says, well, they always planned this. Well, to some degree, I believe they had envisioned a version, but not doing it so soon. But the inaction of the bourgeoisie to cooperate with the Bolsheviks, and because if they hadn't, it would have plunged the Russian economy into outright failure, and that would have benefited nobody. But at that point, because of the bourgeoisie's in dislike and outright refusal to cooperate with the government, it kind of forced the Bolsheviks into a corner where they used that as a last card to prevent a collapse of the Russian economy, because they basically argued, okay, you would let this country go down into economic ruin. Yes, you hate us, and we hate you, but we're both going to suffer, and the common people will suffer if we let it collapse. So we're going to nationalize the economy, basically, in every way possible to ensure that you can't try this little trick on us. It was a necessity forced on them in order to prevent a complete economic collapse, but in all sense of the word, I mean, it is kind of a tyrannical move because there's no private enterprise in Soviet Russia. There isn't until 1991, or I would even say late 1980s, because I think Gorbachev might have lifted that a little earlier. But it's not the best move, but it was kind of forced on them at first. However, had they been good people, they would have quickly, once the crisis had passed, probably got rid of that. But no, they were kind of dictators themselves. By December of 1917, the nationalization of industries was legalized within Soviet Russia, and in May 1918, the first industry to be completely nationalized was the sugar industry into a state monopoly. This would be followed by other common commodities such as oil, tobacco, tea, spices, things like that. Those would be the first things that would have their entire industries be nationalized by the state. On June 28th of 1918, all industrial and commercial enterprises were declared by the Soviet Congress to be state property. The state would run them all by June of 1918. So I think for now, or for this week, yep, I think that will conclude the Bolshevik Revolution. Again, it's not really the compared to the February Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution is very quick. It really only lasted one day. I mean, you had a small military attempt to try to reverse it a couple days later, but it failed spectacularly. But in just the scope of one day, October 25th / November 7th of 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Provisional Government and seized power relatively quickly. And as some other people have pointed out, the Bolsheviks were it was shocking that they did, because these were extremists, and these were people that, you know, until recently, they had been in the minority. There was no real expectation that the Bolsheviks were going to have any chance at gaining real political power, but they did. And that was the shocking part of it. Unfortunately, it's going to lead Russia into further chaos over another 3 or 4 years, because there are those in Russia who are not willing to subject to communist rule. And that's going to lead to a whole civil war breaking out. Plus, although the Bolsheviks had called an armistice with the Central Powers, they've not yet fully withdrawn from the war. So they're trying to negotiate, how do we exit from the war on good terms, which is going to be a little bit more difficult than they think. But for this week, I think that concludes our video on the Bolshevik Revolution. So that's a second revolution of the Russian Revolution. So next week, we'll be looking at covering the Russian Civil War, which will conclude this little anthology, whatever you want to call it. And then we'll get on to some different topics. But that will be next week. So for this video, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, added information, anything that you might want to personally point out or anything like that, feel free to put that in the comments section. Any suggestions are also taken for future videos. Trying to think here of anything else I need to make. Oh, I can't think of anything. So again, comment sections, likes, any comments, suggestions, or anything of that nature. Just always looking to hear from, even if they are critical, even if they are in any way. It's just helpful. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we will hopefully see you all back here next week for the conclusion of this with the Russian Civil War and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So until then, everyone have a good week, and hopefully everything goes well.